Hello and good evening. This is Terry Allen. It is November 27th, 2022, and this is Real Progress News. I am going to be presenting a report this evening on Russiagate, and I will be proving that it was a hoax. It was initiated by Hillary Clinton. They took evidence that they knew was false, they knew was fake, and they presented it to the media, and then they took that. Every time the media would come out with it, they would rehash it again to make it look like it was a real story. And so let's watch the first video.
My next guest was chairman of the House Intelligence Committee during the summer of 2016 when the conversation with Hillary Clinton that Robbie Mook referenced in court today took place. Let's bring in Devin Nunes, now CEO of Trump Media and Technology Group. Good to have you with us today. I mean, you took a tremendous amount of grief throughout this story for going over to the White House, for giving them a heads up that there were investigations going on and that there was indications that a lot of this was cooked up as opposition research during the course of the campaign. What's your reaction when you hear that Robbie Mook says, yeah, we took it to Hillary, and she said, absolutely, even though it's not substantiated, you should get it out there to the press. And Mook said, we just figured it was the press's job to figure out whether or not there was any substance there.
Yeah, I think this is an interesting development because, clearly we know that all of these cats that are out there, they all knew about it. We knew from the very beginning. You mentioned, what did we know at the very beginning? Well, we knew that there was no intelligence that showed that the Russians and Trump or Republicans had anything to do with any of this. So why is this interesting today? It's the fact that Mook would turn over his former boss as the campaign manager, who clearly had to have authorized Fusion GPS, Sussman, Perkins Coie law firm, and then sold it out to the media. So I think this is an interesting revelation. Of course, we knew that Hillary Clinton and the whole cabal knew about it, but the fact that he would give up that evidence, direct evidence, almost unprompted from what I'm hearing and seeing outside of the courtroom.
Yeah, so, the suggestion was in the public that Hillary started reading these stories too, and then she started tweeting about them, started retweeting these stories that suddenly appeared in the press. So here's one tweet from Hillary Clinton. It's time for Trump to answer serious questions about his ties to Russia. 4 things you need to know about the Trump Organization's secret server to communicate with Russia's Alpha Bank. And then it goes on to sort of delineate what she sees as, very suspicious behavior here. What strikes me is that, Robbie Mook and Hillary Clinton put out, computer scientists have uncovered that there is a link between the Trump server and Alpha Bank, right? And then you go back to this tech executive number 1 who says that he was hired to access information that he had access to in order to find a narrative that would be negative. So the computer scientists that they're talking about, they act like, they're just sort of amazing random researchers who uncovered something. And yet it appears that they were directed by Mark Elias and by Fusion, it appears.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to the whole thing of how they hired Christopher Steele. And then don't forget, he was a former MI6 guy. He was the guy that they wanted. And then you take secondarily the Danchenko, the Russian, who wasn't really Russian. He was a guy that had formerly worked at Brookings, lived in Washington, D.C. This was similar. So this kind of came after the fact. This information went into the Steele dossier. And so what they did there at the end, right in late October, it was kind of their last gasp effort to do an October surprise. Now, what comes after that is, I think, more interesting, because when these guys go into the CIA and other intelligence agencies, it's after Donald Trump won. And clearly now they have went from kind of a dirty tricks, trying to cover for Hillary Clinton's, destroying of her servers. They then move into this trying to get the FBI to further their investigation and publicize their investigation that led to Mueller, that led to this whole mess, which is a very dark chapter of American history, especially for the dirty cops at the FBI and DOJ that knew about this. The Clintons have always been up to dirty tricks, but the fact that they corrupted our intelligence agencies and the media, who some are sitting in court right now, putting out live reports, they were ones who received this very information and wrote about it, and now they act like, oh my God, I didn't know anything about this. It's absolutely amazing to watch this unfold. And I think Durham's issue here is not going to be that he doesn't have evidence. His issue is going to clearly be that 95% of the people in Washington, D.C. didn't vote for Donald Trump. And then you have jurors who definitely supported Hillary Clinton. Some even know Sussman, or they're friends with Sussman's kids. I think that's Durham's bigger challenge he's going to have to get over, Martha.
Yeah, there are a lot of questions about the venue of this and how difficult it's going to be. And just to keep in mind for everybody at home, if they suddenly hear, oh, nothing came of this, it's a very delineated question the jury faces. They have to decide, did Michael Sussman lie to the FBI when he said that he was there, not on behalf of clients? And that is the pinpoint. That's what they have to decide. But what's so interesting about this is that it is forcing out all of this other information about what was going on. So we'll all see once it's forced out there whether or not this ball moves forward, separate from perhaps this very, very fine point issue that is at issue in this case here. Devin Nunes, thank you very much. Always good to have you, sir.
My pleasure,
Good to
Martha.
see you.
Thank
Have
you.
a good weekend.
Okay, the second video that I will be presenting now is an interview that was done in 2019 by Matthew Ogden and Barbara Boyd from the LaRouche PAC in Washington, D.C. And they will be interviewing Bill Binney. He was a former NSA computer expert and software writer. He was part of the team that wrote the software for the NSA to monitor every text, phone call, and email, every single one. But he built in a filter so they could filter everything out except specific targets, specific terrorist cells and people. What happened when he left was that the NSA took all those filters back off. So now they were able to get a hold of everything. And that's the information that came from Edward Snowden, which Glenn Greenwald uncovered and reported on. And then they're also going to be interviewing Larry Johnson. He was a former CIA analyst, and he was worked in the State Department. And so he has firsthand information on how some of this was all put together and how the Clinton operation worked against Trump.
Barbara and I are joined by two very special guests today, both of whom are members of the VIPS, the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We're joined by Mr. Larry Johnson, who is a former CIA analyst and worked in the counterterrorism department of the State Department and has run a consulting firm for 25 years. Thank you very much for joining us, Larry, today.
Good to be with you.
And joining so is, dare I say, the legendary Mr. Bill Binney, a former technical director of the NSA and also very notorious whistleblower. Thank you very much, Bill, for joining us here today.
Oh, good to be with you, yeah.
Now, we are on a campaign here at LaRouchePAC.com where we are calling on the American people to demand that both of these gentlemen be immediately brought into special hearings in the U.S. Congress, in the Intelligence Committees and in the Judiciary Committees of both the House and the Senate to testify on two parallel, very significant issues. And we're here today to present the evidence on these two issues. One, the entire Russian hack narrative is false. Today's equivalent of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, that intelligence so-called that was fabricated by elements within the U.S. intelligence community. Bill Binney is the expert on that, and he will present his proof. And number two, the foreign intelligence agency which should be being investigated for interfering in our democratic electoral process is the British, specifically British intelligence. Larry Johnson is the expert on that, and he will be presenting his evidence. So our objective here today is to present this case to as wide of an audience as possible, but specifically with the intent that President Trump hear this case, hear the evidence that is presented here today, and act on that evidence. I guarantee you, President Trump is very familiar with both of these gentlemen and the work of both of these two men. A little bit over a year ago, in November of 2017, Bill Binney was invited by Mike Pompeo, then director of the CIA, on orders by President Trump to visit CIA headquarters at Langley, Virginia, and to present the evidence to Mike Pompeo. Pompeo did that. He met with Bill Binney, but has thus far failed to follow through and act on what Mr. Binney had to say. And a little bit over 2 weeks ago, we saw President Trump post this tweet on his Twitter feed, directly referencing an interview on One American News Network by Larry Johnson. This is what he said, quote, "Former CIA analyst Larry Johnson accuses United Kingdom intelligence of helping Obama administration spy on the 2016 Trump presidential campaign. Wow. It is now just a question of time before the truth comes out, and when it does, it will be a beauty." That's President Trump. Now, I also guarantee you that President Trump, however directly or indirectly, is also very familiar with the work of our third guest, my co-host here today, Ms. Barbara Boyd. As I said, Barbara Boyd is the author of the original LPAC pamphlet, which laid out in detail the attempted coup that was in progress against the presidency of the United States. She provided the necessary strategic background to understand what the impetus, the intent of that operation was, which I'm sure she will go through. And she also showed that the same apparatus and many of the same players who are involved in the operation against President Trump today were directly involved in the frame-up and prosecution of Lyndon LaRouche. Now, I'd like to just start with Barbara, and we were just discussing shortly before the show, Barbara, you've got a total war going on in Washington, D.C. right now around this. You've got the Trump presidency waking up and clearly identifying, at least in the beginning, what the elements actually are and what this attempted coup really was. But then you have these stay-behind both Republicans, these overt neocons, the never-Trumpers, and also the so-called Democrats. These are not your grandfather's FDR Democrats or JFK Democrats. Ironically, many of the same generation who were involved in the anti-war movement in the 60s and the civil rights movement in the 60s, this kind of activism, which was targeted by the FBI and the Justice Department. Now they are in love with the FBI and the CIA. So the question is, at this time, where we have a population, some of whom are waking up to what this was, but you still have 40% of the U.S. population who believe in their heart of hearts that President Trump is a Russian agent and he was put in office by a Russian intelligence operation with the Russians stealing the 2016 election. How can we expose what this is and bring the American people together and to bring them back from the brink of what could be hopeless insanity?
Well, to answer your question, Matt, the essential thing here is exactly what the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity have focused on. They're not partisan, and essentially what they've done is a scientific analysis of what we will call the biggest lie which has been told about so-called Russiagate. That is that the Russian military intelligence hacked the computers of the DNC and John Podesta and then provided the files to WikiLeaks for a staged publication to actually influence the 2016 election in Donald Trump's favor. If you think back to the period of November, December, January, November, December of 2016, January of 2017, when clearly a whole battle plan was set into motion, what we're now calling an effective coup d'etat against the President of the United States, the central lie, the central feature of that was exactly this particular notion, which has been repeated in both congressional investigations, and it's been repeated by Robert Mueller in both his report and in his indictment of several GRU officials for conducting this. What the VIPs have focused on, as opposed to anything our intelligence community has offered us, is proof that this indeed did not happen. Scientific evidence, forensic evidence, that this indeed did not happen. People have been told a massive and big lie. And Bill Binney has pioneered this by actually conducting experiments with a whole group of people to demonstrate this, looking at the actual WikiLeaks file, looking at this crazy persona called Guccifer 2.0, proving more or less, and I think a lot more, that this just did not happen. He's recently submitted an affidavit in Roger Stone's criminal case, which is pending in the U.S. District Court for Washington, D.C. You can expect some fireworks, which have already started around that. I saw an article in Mother Jones today. Mother Jones, of course, being the magazine which touted Christopher Steele and the entire British operation and was working straightforwardly with the FBI throughout this thing, attacking Bill Binney's affidavit. The government itself is going to have to take a stand. So I'd like to start out with Bill, the former technical director of the NSA, the guy who wrote all the programs which actually are at issue here, as opposed to what the government's apparently trying to say now that he's old hat. He actually wrote the programs. And I'd like him to tell us, Bill, I'd like you to focus on this just like you were talking to Donald Trump. And you were telling him in the form that he can understand and the American public can understand, show us that this didn't happen. How would you show that?
Well, first of all, I would firstly address the DNC data that was posted by WikiLeaks. And that clearly showed evidence of a property called a file, fat format file. That's the file allocation table format, meaning every time it's reading, it's a program and a software used to read data to a storage device, either a thumb drive or CD-ROM, something like that. And as it does that, it changes the last modified time on each file to the nearest even second. Okay, it's just a function of that program. So when that occurs, all those times of last modified are changed on all the files. So when we looked at all the DNC emails from the 23rd, 24th, and 25th of May, all of them ended in even numbers. So, and that was 500, probably a little more than that. I didn't count all. So, but that means that the random chance of that occurring would be 1 chance in 2 to the 500th power. In other words, 1 chance in a 1 followed by over 150 zeros, meaning it's obviously that was a factor that proved that a program was used to do that, and the program that does it is FAT, file allocation table formatting. So that says that that data was downloaded to a physical device, either a thumb drive or CD-ROM, and then transported physically before WikiLeaks could publish it or put it on the web. So that said to us that it wasn't a hack from Russia. It was an inside job or somebody close in that downloaded the data to a storage device and then took it physically. That also fit in with what former Ambassador Craig Murray said about former ambassador to Uzbekistan from the British ambassador. He had said that he met somebody in the American University campus who was involved in the transfer of data to WikiLeaks. That also fit with Kim.com, who came out recently and said that he helped certain people do that to transfer data to WikiLeaks. So that kind of said to us that this whole business about saying that the DNC data was a hack by Russia was just a fabrication. And then when we came to Guccifer 2, we looked at all that data, and we looked at what was posted by Guccifer 2, saying, "Here's what I hacked from Russia in the DNC," and we looked at that. And each file that was posted had a timestamp at the end of it, and the whole segment went over 87 seconds, and that included about 16 gigabits of data. So he made 2 hacks, one from the 5th of July and one from the 1st of September. So if you looked at the data, the file name, the data, amount of data in the file, and the timestamp at the end, it just did the differencing the timestamps between files, you could calculate the rate of transfer of data. And that's what we did for all the files. So, and the highest rate we got was 49.1 megabytes per second. Now, that to us would not go across the international web, across the Atlantic to Russia from the US. And we said that in articles. And we got some pushback from even some of our own members who thought that could in fact happen. And so we said, okay, we'll test it. And we tested it from Albania, Serbia, the Netherlands, and the UK, and found the fastest rate of transfer we got was 12.0 megabytes per second, which is less than 1/4 the necessary capacity to transfer just the data on that high rate file. So we again said we could not, we could clearly show that we couldn't get it across at that rate. And if you think you know, or if anybody thinks they know where you can do that, let us know and we'll try it and test it. So far, no one has pointed to any path that we can use to get that data across at that rate, nor have we been able to find any. Now, it is true that you can transfer that rate of data if you're in a local high-speed network. And that's basically what we said. We thought it was a local download off the high-speed network that was connected to those servers. So again, that looked like very clearly proof of a transfer via physical means, either a thumb drive or CD-ROM. And then when we looked at the two dates, the 5 July and the 1 September data, and looked at the timing of them and looked in the different, how you could merge them. If you only looked at seconds and minutes, why you could take those two files and merge them into one. That is where one file ended in the July material, another file would pick up in the September. And then, in other words, all the files in September fit in gaps of time gaps in the 5 July data. So the random probability of that happening, again, is exceedingly low. So that meant, again, that to us anyway, that meant forensically, Goose for Two was playing with the data, and he's playing with us. So again, it turned out that from our basic forensics evidence that this was a total fabrication too. So and having, for example, the other factor that was less important to us, those were the two main ones: the timing and the FAT file format. But then when you looked at how the DNC data was drawn down in May, it was taken down and dated on the 23rd, skipped the 24th, and picked out again the 25th and the 26th. So there was 3 separate batches taken down. So that to us would say, gee, if I were a hacker going in and I got in, I would take everything I could as fast as I could and not go back because they're liable to catch me, you know. So again, that was just a little less reliable than simply the FAT format. I mean, the FAT format was clearly demonstrable and provable as evidence of a download to a storage device. So that's the basic evidence that we were using. And forensically, that's the forensic evidence no matter what anybody says. And we've had people who are still saying you can get it across there at that rate. And we're saying, okay, where? How? Let us try it, you know? So nobody's come forward to say where we can do it. And we have not found a place to be able to do that.
If I were the President of the United States right now and I went to the NSA and I said, show me the proof that Russia did this, what would you be asking the NSA for?
I would ask them for the trace routes of the packets that from the DNC to Russia. They've got trace route packets on with the Treasure Map program, the objective of which is to monitor and know where every device is in the world all the time, every minute of the day. So, and they watch that also with trace route programs by the hundreds here in the US and across and around the world. The whole idea there with the trace route program is you can follow the packets as they move through the network. And you can keep that as a record. And that's what they're doing. They're trying to use that to reconstruct the Tor network, for example, is one of the main things that they're using that for. But it also gives you the evidence of all you need is just one packet from the DNC data, and it gives you in the TCP/IP format. It gives you all the addressing and where it's going from, where it originates from, where it's ending up. And you can see how it gets through the network. That way, you can see the timing through the different segments of the network and so on. So I would ask them very simply, okay, you're saying that Russians hacked this. Where are the trace route packets showing the packets going to the Russians? And then again, where are the packets, the trace route programs showing the packets going from the Russians to WikiLeaks? That's what I'd say.
Coming back to the basic point here again to emphasize to our audience, when the intelligence community announced this in December and January of 2017, the American public was told that effectively by John McCain and others that an act of war had occurred by Russia against the United States. Think about that and just think about what Bill Binney just told you. He said that Article 5 of NATO should be invoked, which would have caused us to go to war with Russia. That's what's involved in that. Then, on top of that, they brought out this assessment in January of 2017, again with no evidence, saying essentially, believe us, ahead of the president's inauguration. At the same time, you had people arguing that this silly, spurious, discredited, and completely fabricated dossier by MI6 agent Christopher Steele, and there's kind of a firing squad going on between the various culprits in Washington, D.C. right now as to who did this. It was either Comey or John Brennan who were arguing that in this assessment saying that Russia committed an act of war against the United States, what happened was, that somebody was going to put the Steele dossier verbatim into that intelligence report or arguing for it. Just think about that. What that would have done is would have told the American people, we in the American intelligence community believe that Donald Trump is a puppet of Putin, the president who's about to be inaugurated. In my view, that's about as close to a coup d'etat as we've ever come in the United States. You had people in the streets at that point in time. You had a massive mobilization. You also had the first inkling of the censorship drive, which has accompanied all of this at the same time. Groups were putting out all sorts of materials, one called Proper Not, which is primarily Ukrainian and associated with the British Integrity Initiative, targeting every single website in the United States which was voicing a dissenting view and saying all of these websites are Russian propaganda vehicles and should be shut down. And we're seeing that right now accompanying still what's been going on around Russiagate, a deliberate attempt to censor any alternative viewpoint in the United States on the right or on the left or in between. So this is very, very, very significant what Bill is saying. You know, what he's saying is we almost went to war in the case of Russia. Obviously, we're talking nuclear war at this point, based on a fabrication. It's also said that in sanctioning Russia at this point in time, President Obama inserted some form of device into the infrastructure of the Russian state, leaving it to Donald Trump whether that device would be activated and could cripple their infrastructure. Many people, including Professor Stephen Cohen, have continued to comment on this because, in effect, that was an act of war against the Russian state. And that puts into completely different perspective what Michael Flynn was trying to talk to the Russians about, not reacting to what Obama was actually doing and actually sanctioning them for back then. So there's a lot more to this entire story than we even know. And William Barr looks like at this point he's going to go forward and actually expose it all. Our part here is get Benny's materials before the American public, and the most effective way to do that is with congressional hearings and with the Justice Department exploring it, and in an adversary setting where the people who say Russia hacked the DNC have to come forward and give their proof. Bill, do you have anything else to say to wrap up your point here?
Yeah, I just have one other thing to say. Kind of the bottom line, I think, to it was before President Obama left office, he said the fact that the idea the Russians were hacking into the DNC data was the evidence for that was inconclusive. So that was basically what I was saying from the beginning, that from August of 2016, really, that NSA would be out there definitely saying where this happened, who did it, where the data went, where it came from, how it transited the network, and everything. They would know all of that. But they didn't say anything. They only had moderate confidence in that ICA in January of Intelligence Community Assessment on Russiagate in January of 2017.
Larry, you've been very prominent in actually sounding the alarm bells. The president tweeted your tweet concerning the British role in all of this. We've said here persistently that if any foreign entity intervened into the 2016 elections, it was British intelligence, a little bit of NATO, and also, many other nations, it appears, in Europe, including Ukraine. What do you have on that, and what would you like to tell the president and our readers needs to be explored here?
The effort, I first talked about this back in March of 2017. I appeared on Russia Today TV show and was commenting on Donald Trump's remarks that he'd been wiretapped by the FBI. At that point, I had not seen his full remarks, in which he acknowledged that he was using wiretapping as a broader term to cover lots of different activities, such as not just electronic surveillance, but other types of spying. But I made the comment then, and it went unnoticed for 2 weeks. Nobody paid attention to it. So, if nothing else, that tells you how much RT lacks in influence in the United States and in shaping public opinion, public debate, despite claims to the contrary by the Central Intelligence Agency and their intelligence that in community assessment that came out in January of 2017. It was a joke. They claimed that RT was somehow so influential, yet for being so influential, I said something that was very provocative. It elicited not even one comment or remark. About 3 weeks after that, Judge Napolitano obtained information from a discussion we had at the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity bulletin board. And he went on television with it and was immediately suspended because doing it on Fox did attract attention, and it alarmed the British. The British have put pressure on the Murdoch family, and the Murdoch sent down word to get Napolitano off. And in the context of that, Judge Napolitano called me and asked me to speak to the New York Times reporter Michael Grinbaum on his behalf, which I foolishly did, thinking that Grinbaum could be trusted to report the story fairly and accurately, both of which assumptions turned out not to be true. That then led to just an immediate firestorm. I was under attack. They were calling me everything but a child murderer. And the story was dismissed because I was a so-called conspiracy theorist. But that went on that was 2 years ago, and now it's resurfaced. And we know a lot more now today than we did 2 years ago. This entire effort to go after Donald Trump didn't start initially as a targeting just Trump. It was in fact targeting all of the political candidates that Hillary Clinton anticipated facing. And what I am told by someone who is in a position to know is that this initiative to enlist the British and other foreign intelligence agencies and collection campaigns to produce intelligence that could be of benefit to the Clinton campaign started in the summer of 2015. And initially, it was not just against Donald Trump. It included Ted Cruz, Ben Carson, and it included Bernie Sanders. We now know, and there were reports back in 2017, that, for example, Samantha Power was accused of having unmasked more than 260 people affiliated with just the Trump campaign. Now, to your average viewer, that doesn't mean anything. Well, what does unmasking mean? Unmasking means that the names of 260 people appeared in either an intelligence report prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency or an intelligence report prepared by the National Security Agency. Neither the CIA nor the NSA are permitted to name U.S. citizens by name in these reports. So they'll have a generic description like person A or subject one, etc. But when you want to know their identity, you have to go through a process and fill out some paperwork. So there is a paper trail. And that process is called unmasking, where you take the mask, take the name, the false name put there, and reveal the true name of the person. So when you're talking about 260 different names unmasked, you're talking about a lot of intelligence reports. The normal process in which the intelligence community is supposed to work is that they have collection plans to say, for example, we're going to monitor the Russians to see if they are interfering in any of our electoral activities or participating with any campaigns. So we are now left with there are only two possibilities in this. Either the intelligence community accurately identified intelligence that showed that the Russians were doing this, or they didn't. And as Bill pointed out, when Barack Obama left office, despite all of this intelligence reports that were coming in, they didn't have conclusive evidence. The entire process, though, was designed to create a pretext. Because if you can point to something that's classified and claim that it shows some sort of relationship without exposing that in many of those reports, the relationships that were being described were in fact created by other intelligence operations. As an example, in the case of George Papadopoulos, the British used their own intelligence assets, one of whom is Joseph Massoud, to make an approach to George, to offer to get George information about the Russians and dirt that they had on the Clinton campaign. George Papadopoulos is in London at the time when he's getting this information. He communicates that via an email back to the United States. Well, that communication is intercepted both by the National Security Agency and by British intelligence. It's then produced in a report that Subject A in Britain communicated to Subject B on Candidate One's campaign about having dirt on Hillary Clinton. Well, that all of a sudden, that's intelligence. That's proof. So you can go to the FBI and say, we've got intelligence that shows that there's some smoke here and we've got to investigate it. And yet they don't admit that the entire thing was staged. But by staging that kind of thing, you can plant information that appears to be true, even though it's a lie. And so that's how this thing started. And then as the campaign progressed from the summer of 2015, getting into late winter 2015, early spring 2016, it became clear that Donald Trump was the front runner. And it was at that point that this covert action, because there's no other way to describe it, but it was a covert action that involved both British and American intelligence assets, as well as U.S. law enforcement assets in the FBI, to create the impression, to feed the meme that Donald Trump was acting with and at the behest of Vladimir Putin. That whole plot began to be unfolded in earnest in March and April of 2016.
You've pointed to in your writings a specific email on WikiLeaks between John Podesta from the Clinton campaign, the chairman of the Clinton campaign, way back in December of 2015. He's talking to a reporter from the Hill newspaper, and they're talking about the fact that way back in December of 2015, the most effective tactic against Donald Trump was going to be to smear him based on his buddy-buddy relationship with Putin. Can you say anything more about that?
Well, let's understand that the individual, Brent Badowski, is the one who was in the email exchange with John Podesta. Badowski is not a Hill reporter. Badowski is a longtime Democratic staff member and had served up on the Hill. So he's been very plugged in with Democrat politics for quite a while. The fact that they're discussing using they were going to, I think the exact phrase was slaughter Donald Trump for his bromance with Putin. And so it was clear that the Clinton campaign took the decision to start using the Putin angle as a way to attack and discredit Donald Trump. So there is the other element in this is that when you look at the law firm of Perkins Coie was the one who was involved with bringing CrowdStrike into the DNC to, quote, establish, to investigate the alleged Russian hacking of the DNC. I think the simple fact that they brought CrowdStrike in for that was part of a pretext to blame the Russians because they knew that it was not the Russians who actually did this. It was also Perkins Coie that hired Fusion GPS, who then in turn hired Christopher Steele. And yet what we've also learned is that throughout this process, there were FBI informants, confidential human sources that were being targeted against the Trump campaign. Christopher Steele, for example, we know without a doubt that as of February 2016, and perhaps even earlier, but we know for certain that in February 2016, he was a fully signed up confidential human source for the FBI. And he was, as was later admitted, was the one who alerted his FBI handler to this nefarious activity by the Russians that he was picking up from his intelligence sources. We know that Felix Sater, who's actually in the news today, was an FBI confidential human source. He was the one that proposed to the Trump campaign that they go do something in Russia, build a Trump Tower in Moscow. He was the one that initiated that. It wasn't Donald Trump Jr., it wasn't Donald Trump, it wasn't Ivanka Trump. None of the Trumps that, they'd have not a single shred of evidence of them sitting around saying, you know what, we ought to do something in Moscow. Let's get a hold of Felix and ask him to help us. It was just the opposite. Finally, you had a character by the name of Henry Greenberg. He's actually got 10 different names. He was signed up 17 years ago by the FBI as a confidential human source. And he approaches first Michael Caputo, who then puts him in touch with Roger Stone and offers to sell dirt on Hillary Clinton. They declined the offer. So when you're seeing that kind of effort by the FBI, it totally explodes the lie that the FBI is telling, that they didn't start looking at this hard until Alexander Downer, an Australian diplomat who has ties to MI6 as well, and was a key member in a firm comprised of former MI6 officers known as Hacklut. Alexander Downer, who had a personal relationship with Bill Clinton, had signed a $25 million deal with him on behalf of the Australian government with the Clinton Foundation. Downer shows up 2 months after allegedly having this conversation with George Papadopoulos to suddenly report an alarming thing that he heard 2 months ago. I mean, it's so ludicrous, the fact that you've got educated adults believing this crap and repeating it just makes you want to scratch your head and recognize that, this has nothing to do with reality. This is all a contrived fantasy.
Okay, that was it for this evening. One of the things that I want to mention is some new information that came out just in the last couple of days. And that information is that when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago looking for secret classified documents, what they actually were looking for were the documents that Trump took from the White House, was all the documents that he had been collecting on Russiagate, the Russiagate hoax, everything that Hillary Clinton was doing, and how it was all laid out, all the truth. That's what they were looking for. That was what they were trying to get a hold of. So that is very interesting. Let's see how that turns out. All right, everyone, have a good evening and peace.